So I'm going to just speak briefly. I think that John covered a lot of what I wanted to say in more detail. So I just wanted to sort of frame the next two sessions. So the economic valuation session and then the implementation session at the end, which includes design, policy, markets, and basically, the question that you may be thinking after the next, already is, well, how do we do any of this, right? What do we do on the ground? How do we start to take some action? So we will hopefully get to all of that. What I wanted to talk about a little bit is just to follow up on what John had said and kind of introduce what will be talked about in the next session. The idea that ecosystems and economics can actually really help each other. And being an economist, I'm going to take that perspective on it and how economics can be useful and helpful. I think Don framed it pretty well when he said that economics controls the environment, so economics can be a cure for the environment. So we hear a lot about the green economy, right? And we hear a lot about green infrastructure or natural infrastructure. What is the green economy? What are green jobs? What is clean technology? Some of it depends on who you ask, but you think about green infrastructure and using natural areas as infrastructure. Well, if you think about man-made infrastructure, it's very costly. It's effective and it's very costly. Natural infrastructure could maybe be cost-saving. It also could provide additional benefits. So if you think of a green space, for example, you can have a nice view, right? It can provide a recreation area, but as we just learned this morning, it can also control runoff and erosion and floods and all of these other things that we've been talking about in terms of ecosystem services. So how can economics be useful? Well, we can talk about economic incentives, right? So ecosystem service provision. So who bears the costs of providing an ecosystem service? Whether you're talking about an agricultural landowner or a homeowner. We just talked about this the other day with Deborah Shore, who was talking about how do you get a homeowner to replace their driveway to a permeable pavement, right? So that costs money to do that. There's obviously some benefits that you accrue from doing that. But there's also these social benefits that accrue. You control runoff, right? And you store water, and you provide benefits that are shared among a lot of different people. So how do we get these private provision of ecosystem services to match up with all of those social benefits? Well, price is a very powerful incentive, right? Sometimes I've said that a lot, and sometimes people tell me I'm cynical that we don't need prices all the time. We can appeal to conscience, and of course we can. Prices are effective, though, and they work rather quickly. So we saw what happened when gas was $4 a gallon. People started making changes very quickly. So price can be incentive not only as sort of if you think of as a penalty, but as a payment, right? So it's a payment for an ecosystem service. Economics can contribute to flexible mechanisms. John mentioned cap and trade, for example. So if you can control pollution, if you can promote conservation, the same amount of conservation at a lower cost, it's more likely to happen, right? So those are kinds of things where economics can be very useful. What John spent a lot of time talking about, economic valuation. It's very useful in linking science and policy, right? Science-based policy, and sometimes that gets lost, I think, in policy. And so economics can provide, a way to link these and through common metrics and that. But it's not that simple, right? So a lot of what we've been talking about, this is a lot of what us in economic valuation are trying to learn as well, is understanding the linkage between the structure and function of natural systems, between natures and humans, the interaction. What becomes difficult in some of these methods of valuation that we've been using for a long time is that these relationships are dynamic, they're spatial. Dick Norgaard talked about the scale, right? So it's a lot more complex. And so one thing that really follows up on what John was saying is that a lot of our evaluation methods have been very good at measuring one service, measuring a park for recreation, measuring a forest for carbon sequestration. But as John mentioned, what about the multiple indicators? I think he did. He made the point with the catch rates for the fish that if you looked at that alone, it really didn't show that much economic value. So how do we incorporate this entire, maybe not the entire ecosystem, but multiple indicators which are all connected, all interdependent? If you change one, the other ones change as well. So those are things we have to start thinking about as well. Indicators for economic valuation. So we've been doing economic valuation for a long time. We've been using air quality indicators, health values, visibility. George Tolley has worked very extensively on that. Water quality indicators, fish populations as fish catch rates, as John had said. Beach closures would be another one. Ecosystems and natures, what are the socioeconomic outcomes? Do we have indicators, and can we move beyond just trying to translate indicators that were given to us? But can we try to integrate some of the ecological function with the economic valuation from the ground up? And I think that's a big part of this conference. It's a big part of what Justin and I work on, and I think Esther Bowen and Pam Martin are here as well. And we're trying to, bring together geophysical sciences, ecology, and economics, and try to develop this from the ground up. It helps to understand what the other person's talking about, for sure. So I don't need to say much about the methods. John just covered these, right? And we've long had bioeconomic models looking more at natural resources as inputs, right? So looking at sort of optimal harvest rates for fish and forestry by including the sort of maximum sustainable yield, sort of what are the optimal harvest rates. Something that I think the economists are going to talk a little bit more about is a lot of the studies are up there, the Costanza study included that we've seen, they tend to use avoided costs, right? Costs of treatment, replacement costs, which are very understandable, they're very tangible, they're easier to measure. They don't necessarily represent full economic value, though. And so, we have to be careful about that. Secondly, we have to be careful about just transferring those numbers from one place to another, right? As we just saw, one wetland doesn't equal another wetland. And so a lot of times we use benefit transfer meta-analysis because, as John stated, it's very expensive to do a survey, to do a contingent valuation survey, to do a travel cost study. You need time, you need resources, you need funding, and so the next sort of best alternative is benefit transfer, but we just have to be careful in how we use that. A lot of developments that are being made now, and I think Eric is going to talk some about this, he's right there, developments in spatial analysis and ecosystem mapping that also includes economic valuation. So there's a huge frontier of opportunity in that field where I think we'll be working a lot. So, what is the progress that we're making? Well, obviously the fact that we're all sitting here talking about this, that this is evolving, right? And John showed you the growth in publications in this area. We're starting to try to understand the interdependency of function and services. The services that are generated, how do they change over time? When you start generating one ecosystem service, what happens to the other services? Are you generating multiple services at one time? Or are you trading off services for each other? It's difficult to generalize values, as I've said with the benefit transfer, but we can certainly try to develop methods that can be applied in different places, different regions. Markets, and this gets in a little bit to maybe the third session as well, in that markets are emerging, but still not very well established, right? So what do we need for markets to work? We know by now we need information, participation in information. So, if we talk about farmers, for example, they know how to market crops. Do they know how to market ecosystem services? Do they know how to identify ecosystem services? So information is a big thing. Accounting, verification. So if you offset, the offsets are a big deal with markets, with cap and trade. How do we account for carbon, right? How do we measure carbon? How do we verify it? What's a carbon footprint? There's a lot of difficulties in that. Additionality, right? So making sure that, what you're paying for in a market wouldn't have happened otherwise, wouldn't have happened without the payment, right? We want additional conservation, we want additional protection at the margin, right? And the trade-off. So are you getting paid for carbon, but you're generating a whole host of services that you're not getting paid for? Likewise, are you generating carbon but compromising the ecosystem in other ways, right? And so we were talking about this a bit at lunch, and economists get trade-offs, right? This is Econ 101, is the trade-off. But are we really paying attention to the trade-offs of ecosystem services, right? And so I think that's a very important concept, and one that Justin and I talk about, and we, ran into just the other day when you were giving a talk, right? So what about our notion of polluter pays, right? We've heard this notion that the polluter pays. Maybe it's through litigation, maybe it's punitive, but what if we change it, right? In economics, you could argue that, well, you could pay the polluter not to pollute, right? Do we set a precedent of paying polluters? Well, we've done that, right? The Conservation Reserve Program, right? That's a perfect example. And there, we haven't thought there's well, it depends on who you ask, but the equity concern of that hasn't been, the idea of, it depends who you pay, I suppose, is the answer. But it's really a question of property rights, and that's very well connected to the cap and trade program. Do you auction allowances, or do you give them away? In the end, in the economic argument, it really doesn't make that much difference, but it does make a difference in terms of the property rights. Similarly, is there potentially a moral hazard problem in that if you're getting paid to reduce pollution, you might not do it until you get paid? You might wait till you get paid? You could even imagine a situation, and I think this has been the concern about China under the Clean Development Mechanism, is you might generate pollution to get paid to reduce it. So these are all things that I'm not trying to say that markets are not a good idea, but things that we have to take into consideration. And so I think that economic valuation and the integrated valuation with ecology can really improve information and reduce the transaction costs. And I think that, what we've all learned about markets, and John made this point with the banking crisis and cap and trade, is that we need the markets to be well informed. We need the participation. You can create a market that doesn't work. So I think that economic valuation can kind of go a long way in this. And just to show you an example of a project that I worked on, some time ago, actually the survey was done in 2000, where we looked at agricultural land conversion in Canada. So this was taking marginal cropland out of production for forestry. And we surveyed farmers who indicated that there's plenty of private benefits in doing that, right? Shelter belts, and they have a lot fewer inputs they need to use to plant. But they weren't really that interested in large-scale planting, even though they knew there were private benefits from doing so. Transaction costs, information, uncertainty, just making a large-scale change in the way that they operate was very hard to grasp. We proposed two things. One is a payment program. So this was, I should back this a little bit, but the government of Canada was interested in if we're going to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, and we're going to set these targets, what's the cheapest way for us to reduce carbon? Is it through land conversion? So we started to look at this. We said, well, okay, if you pay for the external benefits from carbon mitigation, how does that stack up against other ways to reduce carbon, emissions reduction and other things? And so we looked at the total costs of land conversion through different types of tree plantings, and then compared that across CO2 strategies. So by looking just at the costs, right, the hybrid poplar sort of wins this battle every time. One thing that I wanted to revisit with this, and this is where I'm going to engage Justin and some of the other people here, is, well, what are the related ecosystem service strategies, of the two strategies, right? So the costs that we're looking at for these two types of tree plantings, we didn't even think about anything other than carbon, right? And so that is kind of an interesting to think about. It depending on, how you reduce carbon may make a difference, right? It may change your land use. It may reduce other pollutants. It may invite invasive species, right? So I think we really need to look at the whole suite of services that get generated with these types of land use changes. The other big driver that I wanted to mention in this study, this was done in 2000, and we offered the farmers the potential to get into a carbon market. I said, if you generate carbon mitigation, you can get paid for it. And at the time, in 2000, it was like, what, are you crazy? What is that? I don't even understand what that is. But the big question that most people asked us was, how do I have any idea what that carbon is going to be worth? Right? If this is a voluntary market, it might not be worth anything. It might be worth $100 a ton if it becomes a mandatory market. It might be worth $20 a ton. So I think one thing that we took away from that is we need some certainty in a carbon price. Right? That requires probably a mandatory cap and trade or carbon tax. But that was a big problem that the farmers had. Well, we don't really want to do this until we know that there's going to be some return for doing that. We know what the return is if we plant crops and there's subsidy programs and all of those other things. So that's kind of where I will leave it. I raised a lot of questions, so I'll leave it to the economics panel to answer a lot of them. And I'll turn it over to Professor Norgaard, who is from UC Berkeley, and a lot of you had the pleasure to hear speak last night. So.
Okay. Well, moderators frequently introduce their session, and Dr. Scheck has done that far better than I could, and I'm not going to say, here's why we have to listen to the economists now that we've listened to the ecologists. Frequently there's various jokes about economists. If you laid them all in the end, they'd never reach a conclusion. And fortunately we only have 4, so that's not going to be, we might reach a conclusion. The other is President Truman saying, give me a one-handed economist, because they're always saying on the one hand, on the other hand, on the other side. And I tried to, during lunch, organize our group to get into a little bit of a debate and duke it out, but they all agreed that they're in agreement. They're going to put a constructive, positive spin on it and come out with, one solid, constructive panel session. We'll see if we can do it. We've got an excellent speaker to begin with, George Tolley, who's going to talk about the history of environmental valuation, just to give some perspective on sort of what we have to build from and some of the differences between the old challenges and the new challenges. We have Juha Sikamaki from Resources for the Future, who's going to be stressing that we don't want to just do benefit valuation. We need to look at costs as well. You need to do both to do benefit cost analysis, and sometimes you need to do cost effectiveness analysis. And so he'll be sorting out some of those differences. Amy Ando from the University of Illinois is going to be giving practical examples of benefits valuation from her work with agriculture and biomass, I believe. And Eric Nelson is going to try to give the practical applications of how do you build a system that many people can use to do benefit valuation across different ecosystems where the structure stays the same, but you still need to spend time making sure you've got the parameters right. And so George is going to start off and speak from the mic here, so we'll need the mic at the table activated, and then the other speakers will come up to the podium here. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dick. I'll try to be brief. Can you hear me?
Not yet.
No? Okay. What do I do?
Do we have this mic activated? Pull it closer.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear the feedback, so I know. Okay, well, Sabine and I were talking I was thinking about how we got to this point, and we're, of course, midstream, but we're getting ecologists and economists closer together than ever before. So how did we get here, and what might it point to for the future? That's for discussion all day here. I was struck, Dick, last night you talked about the concern with conservation and preservation and so forth that began to emerge in the last half of the 19th century. As we all tell our class, environmental economics also began in the last half of the 19th century, and it was the answer to Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and that taught us a very important thing, that if you have competition, then competition among people tends to make everybody as well off as possible under certain assumptions. And that is the foundation of economics. That's why economists are so interested in markets and the functioning markets. Anyway, about 100 years later, there was a very able economist, and he was in Victorian England, and he really had the first example of environment. It had to do with air pollution. But he noticed that the smokestacks in Victorian England were going down the road and soiling the clothes that women were washing. He didn't know too much about health effects, which were mainly the real effects of it. But anyhow, he said there is a divergence between marginal private cost and marginal social cost. And the way we put that now is there are externalities that the competitor in the market doesn't take account of. And so there are these externalities. And then it means that there's a market failure. Markets don't fail all the time, although there are people all over the spectrum who have different opinions about this. My own opinion is that markets work most of the time for many things, but there are some very, very important things having to do with the environment where they don't work, and that gets into market failure. So, as I always say, Pigou, environmental economics, the concern with the environment, began in about 1876 with A.C. Pigou. That's a long historical note, but I was very interested. I never thought about it in terms of it's coincidental with the preservations, the ecology interest. Okay, let's fast forward. There's a whole history here. I promised I would be brief, and let me try. I will. So then we come really after World War II, and there was a concern with water resources. There was a concern with whether we're going to run out of resources. And a part of I'm getting too detailed here, but anyhow, after Henry Ford died, they started the Ford Foundation, and the great bulk of it was what the Ford Foundation does. But then the people in charge says, let's take a little bit of this and devote it to this question of what the future holds in terms of our use of resources. And they started a foundation which has been very important to this field and is still today. It was called Resources for the Future. That's where Resources for the Future came in. I'll try not to be autobiographical, but at that time I was being hired as an assistant professor here, and Ted Schultz was my mentor, and the people said, who were coming into Resources for the Future, said, we will make our first grant to the University of Chicago for Theodore W. Schultz to study whether we're running out of resources, really. So he wasn't going to do it himself, so he hired me. So I was thrust into water resources. I worked for several years on water resources in the West, and I still know a lot about it, but I haven't kept up with it all that much. In the process of that, we discovered in the water resource area, back in 1936, there had been this mysterious passage appended to the Flood Control Act of 36, and it said the benefits shall exceed the costs of any water project that the federal government sponsors, finances. That should exceed the costs no matter to whomsoever they occur. Well, in today's jargon, that means they shall be economically efficient. And there's something called the Green Book. I'll get into much detail here. I must try to go ahead. It laid out the first principles of benefit cost analysis. So we discovered that book, and I became a benefit cost person at that point, and still am. I still do that. So anyhow, that's some of the history. The reason we're mentioning this is that then let's fast forward quickly. We come to the one day. See, they started trying to control the environment in 1960 with these voluntary air sheds, and nothing happened. So about 1970, Richard Nixon, of all people, said, I sense the American people want to do something about the environment. And so he was able to get Congress to pass the Clean Air Act. And then the Clean Air Act, among many, many things it did, it said that the benefits of any environmental control program shall be estimated. And that clause has been responsible, probably still to this day, for an enormous amount of research on the benefits of environmental control. So then, myself, like many other people, we get into the environment. It had a natural resources overtone to it. So the beginnings of environmental economics are in natural resource economics, and many of us came into the field for that. And then the 70s began, and everything broke loose. And then, okay, I want to tell, I didn't want to be autobiography, but I will tell this because I think it roughly traces a lot of things that were going on. Then the NSF made a grant jointly to Argonne and the University of Chicago to study air pollution, actually in the Chicago area. And the exciting thing about this is that the theory of the control of air pollution actually almost follows from Pigou. The theory was known, but then the economists with the theory come and they say, well, there's this thing about how if you emit you have emissions, then pretty soon they go through the air and they come down as changes in air quality, and those have costs. Well, the economists and the theoretical journals just slap a formula in there, some general formula, and say, yeah, we've taken care of that. They didn't know a thing about what the relations were. So we were working with air quality modelers at Argonne, and what we basically did, to make a long story short, we quantified the damages from air pollution in the Chicago area. And now that I'm trying to make a point here. That was interdisciplinary research. We've been talking about that, and I want to say that from personal experience and from some of the things we've already heard today, when it's very hard to do interdisciplinary research when we're all publishing in our discipline journals, and I can tell some stories about that, but I won't. So anyhow, that went on, and where did we come out? Well, this was an example of how the way, I believe very strongly, to make progress by getting disciplines together is to take some specific problem and everybody bring their expertise to it, rather than each discipline saying, well, I have the answer and I'm not going to pay any attention to the others. So that was an example of that, and it's being continued today. So that's one of the main things I wanted to emphasize. The way to make progress is to have interdisciplinary research on everybody working on the same problem. And I think we're seeing examples of that today. Now, I'm trying to talk about how we got here. Then, what the economics profession did, the people who began to get highly interested in the economics profession, they began to estimate really the health damages and the visibility damages and so forth that are caused by, in this case, air pollution. And so there was a lot of epidemiological work. There was a lot of regression analysis. That's the thing that's bread and butter of empirical economists. They take econometrics and they want to apply these regressions all over the place, and we learn a tremendous amount from that. However, we got into some of that work. That's the traditional way to estimate the benefits. Once you know what the air pollution effect is, then you plug it in. You get a coefficient out of this regression that tells you how much damage you're going to do, how much human life, for instance, you're going to lose from that. And that's all very well. But then you get into that work and you find two things. One, there are a lot of these things that you don't have any. To be an econometrician, you've got to have a set of data, a time series of data, all neat and supplied, all neat in a time series, so you can apply your theories about random variation and all of that to it. And then you have all these variables that you're going to put in the regression. So there are two things. Many of the benefits are not susceptible to that. The ones that are, you soon begin to see, it's not the dirty secret, I don't want to call it that, but it is certainly true. Anybody who is engaged in empirical regression work, I don't care what it is, will find out that those coefficients are quite sensitive to the specification of the regression. So if you're pro-environmental, you'll tend to choose, it's not nefarious or anything, you just tend to choose the regression specification that kind of suits your biases. I don't know how else to put it, but it's something like that. Then if you're anti-environmental, you'll come out and attack that and say, no, if I do it this way. Anyhow, the point is, that analysis, one, it doesn't apply to all the benefits we're trying to get at, and two, it isn't all that good, in spite of these very learned things that you see that have been sponsored about what the statistical significance of this coefficient is and so forth. They're not that significant. They're the best that data could do, but they're not that significant. They're subject to a much greater range of error, frankly, than can possibly be conveyed by the fact that, well, I have this t-value of so and so much. The whole question is, was the whole equation correct? And I don't want to overstate that, but that's the kind of thing that goes on. So then there was a group that I think is still recognized today, and it certainly should. They were in Wyoming, and there was Ralph Darge, who may be really kind of a leader in this, and Bill Schultze, who's still around doing work at Cornell, actually, Jay Sjogren and Tom Crocker, who are still out there. Anyhow, they came up with this idea of contingent valuation, and that actually, where John told you a lot about contingent valuation. One way of putting it is, one unkind way of putting it is, you just go out and ask people. You try to get all this market data and what does it throw light on. If you can't, another way to do it is just go ask people, what would you be willing to pay for this? And that is what contingent valuation is. And however, it's not all that easy to do. There's a science to it, a very developed science that we've been catching a little bit of the flavor of that from what John was telling us this morning. But there we have contingent valuation. So this group in Wyoming took the lead, and they began to go out and design these questionnaires seriously. And it was an alternative to traditional regression analysis. And the profession split. Today, you will probably find that if you take non-environmental economists, so the economics profession at large, they think contingent valuation is, they have a very low opinion of it. They don't buy it. whereas other people do. And this is where environmental economists, or a portion of them, most of them, begin to move toward a broader approach to this. We were doing work then at that time. Actually, after the NSF work, we did a lot of work for EPA. The Wyoming group had done enough work so the EPA bought CV, and we did a lot of CV work here. And why did we do it? It's because of that. People said, well, all these uncertainties about how do you know people are telling the truth and all of that, and there's a lot of sources of bias, and you have to do scientific work to elicit good answers. It's a whole thing there. But then people say, well, you still don't know. There's one philosophy that says, look at what people do, not what they say. And that simple, misleading rule sometimes leads a lot of the economists to say, well, it's not based on observed behavior, so throw it out. We didn't do that here because having run enough of these regressions to know that the traditional ways were highly uncertain too, I happen to be an eclecticist. I said, we'll take estimates wherever we can get them, and we'll bring them together and see what they come out to. Okay, so the economics profession split at that point. And then this brings us to ecology. I want to make this shorter than I'm interested in doing, but I will. So what happened then? Much CV, that original CV work, concerned wilderness areas, things that are really basically ecological. Others didn't, but there's a lot in that. And so this is when people began to get very interested in getting closer to the way that economists can come to grips with this thing. Most economists, if they don't take a course in environmental economics, says the market explains everything. Don't bother with these things that you can't observe in behavior. They must not be very important. And I think most economists, I'm talking about the economics profession at large, don't think all this thing about ecology. I said, sure, that's the effect there, but we don't see much about it. We don't understand it, so we'll kind of assume it's not very important. And that has been a problem. That's why I say the economics profession is split at this point on these things. Now, okay, where are we? I wanted to just put in one carry on forward. I have a lot of notes here about a contingent valuation, but I don't think you want a course in that now. It is not a simple thing. As John says, it's expensive, and if you start drawing in ecologists, it becomes doubly expensive, but you have to, maybe more, I don't know about that. So, okay, so I think we're moving in that direction. I wanted to make a modest suggestion. I don't think it's a cure-all, but it's a very important tool. So I want to go back to what Dick was saying yesterday. He had a production possibility curve between generations. That's what you can do, and if you use up the environment now, you have less for the future generation. That's an ecological problem. Then the present generation has a choice to make. How much are we going to take into account the desires of future generations? And we're getting to sustainability. Again, I'm talking about the economics profession. I think very, very, very many people, including environmental economics, are skeptical of sustainability. Partly they are, frankly, because it's used by a buzzword for so many things. What rigorously does sustainability mean? Well, I think Dick is helping us understand that, and that's people's taste, if you will, what they have a choice to make on how they're going to do the environment. Now, one wording on ethics says we should leave the environment as well off as we found it, but that's not the only choice. We could be way far on that. We could say, well, we need to leave it better off because we've depleted it so much in the past. Anyhow, I want to suggest that we do interdisciplinary work between ecologists and economists on sustainability. So I'll stop here.